everyone. This is Rose Horowitz. I'm a Pulitzer-nominated writer, a journalist, and thank you for joining me today. I'm very honored to welcome my guest, and I'll be introducing her shortly. I'll be speaking with Roya Hakakian, who is a Persian poet, a journalist, and author of several books, and we'll meet her soon. Before I do that, I want to thank my producer, Stefan Kaplan, who does a terrific job producing the show, and a big shout out to my sponsor, Women in Technology International, or WITI. I hope you're watching us on, you can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and YouTube. If you go to YouTube, please subscribe to my channel. It's growing. I want to see more people join, subscribe. And please send me your questions and comments. I'd love to hear any questions. And so thank you. Today I'll be talking to Roya Hakakian, whose latest book is A Beginning Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. There's a copy which I've marked up too. And in this, in very wonderfully poetic language, Hakakian describes the many gifts she and others like her have discovered in America. And she points out many small things, from the variety of cereal boxes we see in the supermarket to the vastness of the landscape that she noticed when she first arrived in America. Hakakian is a recipient, Roya is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and is also the author of Assassins of the Turquoise Palace and Journey from the Land of No, which is a memoir of her life growing up as a girl in Iran. She has published two collections of poetry in Persian. One of them is this For the Sake of Water, which was nominated as Poetry Book of the Year by Iran News. Her poetry has appeared in numerous anthologies around the world, including a pen anthology of contemporary Iranian literature. She's also a human rights activist and is a founding member of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center in New Haven, and serves on the board of Refugees International. Her columns and opinion pieces have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and she's been a guest on NPR's All Things Considered. Earlier in her career, she collaborated on programming for network television news shows, including 60 Minutes. I can't wait to, I'm very honored to have Roya with me today. Hi, Roya.
Hi, Rose.
So great to see you. Thank you.
It's fun.
Yes.
Because we're neighbors.
Yes, we're neighbors. We are both in Connecticut. Yes. And someday I hope I will meet you in person for a conversation.
Yes, we should soon.
Yes. So tell us a little about your latest book, which I held up. And I've been reading it and marking lots of fun, interesting passages.
Right. So it's called A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. And so the immigrant is obvious. The curious are everybody else, people who are not immigrants and were born and raised in this country and are interested in kind of looking at everything in a way that the immigrant sees it. So the book offers a perspective on this country through the eyes of the immigrant. And you and I were talking a little earlier. I started thinking about this in 2016 when so much was being said about, immigrants, dangerous, they steal jobs, they come here to, I don't know, steal and rape and do all sorts of things. And it was really, really shocking for me to see that after all these years that I've been here, and I've been a naturalized American, and I'm so far away from that experience that I started panicking, and I started feeling very, very taking all that really personally, as though it was all about me. And so I started really thinking, why was I feeling this way, and why should this sort of rhetoric affect me, since it's not my problem anymore. And then I thought that so perhaps it was, perhaps there is, I am someone's daughter, I'm someone's mother, I'm an Iranian American, all these things, but perhaps I'm also forever an immigrant, and there is a piece of me that has remained forever a refugee, and that when they attack them, they're in a way attacking me, because that's also who I was and where I come from that experience, that it's not something you can disown and put aside and say, I'm done. So I thought I have to speak on behalf of my brethren. I have to speak on behalf of this community that in a way launched me into America. And so the book.
Do you see the book as sort of, it strikes me in a way, because it talks about yourself and your own experience, but you also talk about other immigrants from other countries and find commonalities. And the book almost is, and it's both sort of a step-by-step guide to what to expect, and then this larger perspective of what does it mean when you leave your country, and everybody is asking you, where are you from? And you talk about having a story, that one has to really be careful and kind of figure out that story, because you're going to be telling that story a long time,
Right.
every time. So do you see, and you even liken it to Tocqueville's book, Democracy.
I don't. Other people
have
commented on the book. Right.
Well, I can see that, because when I started, I thought it would be more personal, but I see you have you have sources in the back, and and you've laid it out by chapters, and you start out with what it's like to land in the airport and be processed, and and then getting the first place to live, and getting going to English as a second language classes. So it was so interesting to see you go through that, and thinking that you had come here. We'll talk about when you first came here, but it'd been many years.
Right.
And I guess my question to you is, did you see this as something you wanted to give to people like yourself, or a new way to look at immigration after all the things you said you were hearing that made you feel vulnerable? And
right. So the fact is that all of us who enter the United States initially, especially those of us who come with no English, aren't ready to pick up a book like that. So there are these silly guides that the State Department has put out occasionally, or various resettlement groups put out for their immigrant communities. And it has this listing of where you should go to get a social security card, and where you should apply for this, that, or the other thing, how to get a driver's license, and how to open your first bank account. So those are the things that a newly arrived immigrant really needs, not a book like mine, which is so much commentary. So you might say, then why did you call it A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant? The truth is that since I panicked in 2016 when I was hearing the things I was hearing, I started reading so many of the books that were being published about immigrants and immigration. And I realized that we were talking at each other, that, there were a bunch of books on the left by people who were critical of, President Trump and what he was saying about immigrants. And then there were a whole slew of books on the right by people who were supportive, and everybody was really truly angry, right? Nobody was actually making sense, or they were too angry to be compelling or to appeal, right? So I thought, after looking at both of these categories of books, I thought that my job wasn't to make a scientific argument. That's not what I could best offer. And I thought the best thing I could offer was to just make a compelling argument on behalf of the immigrant, make the immigrant knowable, feelable, so to speak, and accessible to people who don't know that experience. And I thought if I just do that, that would be good enough. And so I decided that rather than, preaching to people who were worried about immigrants and immigration or wondering about who these people are, best thing I could do is try to appeal to them. And in the process of appealing, I thought, I wouldn't offer data, I wouldn't give a lecture, I wouldn't say, according to the sources or the this series of information and an analysis from such and such think tank on the state of immigrants, we find that immigrants contribute to the economy or pay taxes. And I thought, these things have been said. So I thought, I want to make an appeal. I want to make a visceral appeal by bringing people who don't know that experience really close to the immigrant's experience. And even though I call it a guy, I'm sorry, my dog wants to leave the room, so I'm going to play butler and let them leave, which is what I do so many times a day.
Okay, of course. In the live stream world, we have animals, we have little children, so
yes,
it's fine.
So I opened the door for him, like he has hired me. So anyway, I thought I'm going to talk to this non-immigrant community in America in a discreet and indirect way, because I don't want to be yet another writer or journalist who's pelting them with information. And therefore, I thought if I appear as though I'm talking to a fellow immigrant, and then the non-immigrant feel like they're just eavesdropping on the conversation, maybe that's an easier way to reach them than if I were to, directly address them. And so that was sort of the reason. And, it's my long way of saying that, no, the book isn't really for the newly arrived immigrants. A lot of the children of immigrants who've read the book say, oh my gosh, you remind me of what my mother has said about her experience. But at the end of the day, it was my circuitous way of talking to non-immigrants, really, and saying things to them that I thought would be best put to them indirectly.
Very interesting. I guess some of the things that I just pulled out that I thought were great passages. You talk about first, coming here, and you say, keep the suitcase, but discard the knowledge. It takes months, it takes months, if not years, to sift through all that one has hauled across the continents and decide what to keep and what to scrap.
Right.
And has that, you came here in 1985,
yes.
Right?
Uh-huh.
After the revolution in, Iran. I mean, several years after that, 79. And did you find that it took you a very long time? And do you think that's a common thing? You talk very much about how when you see the people who are waiting for you, they don't care what your religion is, and you had so many of these so many constraints where you were coming from.
Yeah.
That it's interesting to, and as somebody who's not an immigrant, to see what you said about this baggage, and do you find that it's taken you, and was it helpful for you to write this book and see, that process of you becoming who you are? And
Yeah, I mean, I think so many of us just assume the immigrants come here to um, from so many war torn places, and so they come here and there is peace here and there are no bombs or there is no poverty, or I shouldn't say there is no poverty, but they are out of that poverty or whatever trouble that they were in, and they're going to get a job and life is going to be good. And the truth is that it takes such a very long time for that immigrant, not so much to get a job or do the things that we think they must do or they're here to do, but to peel oneself away from the memories and those experiences, to actually live here, not just be here physically, but live here in a way that an invested citizen lives here. Like a lot of people come here, but they are really elsewhere, right? Like I know I've met over the years so many immigrant communities, and especially the elderly. You walk into their homes, and the radio or the television in the language of the country that they come from is in the air, and they don't seem to be connecting with the actual community around them, whether it's through the language or through the activities, right? They don't seem to participate in whatever civic business that we do, whether it's organizing some neighborhood event or whatever. And it's not because they don't love this country. It's because their emotional business with the other country isn't done. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they, it's trauma or whatever. It oftentimes just means that you are entangled with all the things that you've left behind and couldn't bring with you, whether it's relationships or relatives or whatever else that you were, emotionally invested in. And I think that's the thing that people who are trying to help these immigrants, who are often non-immigrant Americans, trying to reach out to them, don't really understand. That they, expect them to take a job and go to work and register for the ESL class and be happy that they're here. And it doesn't. It just doesn't happen that way. And it's not because we are not happy to be here. It's just that we are yet to really actually be here in that holistic way that a human being connects with the world outside of himself or herself. And that's some of the things I try to talk about in the book, as you know.
I think one of the things you focus on are some common phrases, that we hear here, like, move on. You say, that's, we're always told to, and that America is always forward looking. So I guess in that sense, it must be hard to convince somebody that you can't just right away take that job when you had a job as a doctor, or you might have been an engineer, or you might have been a teacher in another country, and you can't do that here.
Right. It's so interesting because for a very brief period of time, I worked in a resettlement organization, refugee resettlement organization, and I used to meet a lot of Eastern European and Russian and Ukrainian, actually, refugees and immigrants who would come in, and people who worked in this organization, and they were superiors to me, would tell them that they had to immediately go to work. And these poor people would bring out of their bags and, folders, and these neatly tied up with ribbons and, carefully folded in kind of plastic sleeves, these, you know, um, certificates and transcripts and all sorts of uh, paperwork to prove what a greatly educated human being he or she was, and he or she would lay it all out in front of my superiors and say, look at me, and I want a few months to learn a little English and find a job in the field that I used to work. Oftentimes it was some kind of top engineer, or some kind of a surgeon or specialist in the field of medicine. And my superiors wouldn't even look at that paperwork, because they too had to abide by the deadlines and certain requirements that they had to fulfill. And it was often that these people had to go to work, any work, within 12 weeks. And so there would be this clash, between the superiors of mine who had to send the refugees to any work, and it would be, some graveyard shift cleaning an office space, and these, former surgeons from, these other countries, or, top engineers with patents to their names, who felt that, they were being crushed in this new country because they weren't being acknowledged or respected for who they were. And I would see that over and over, that somehow the two parties couldn't understand each other, couldn't communicate. It wasn't so much a matter of language. It was that, the immigrant who was there was trying to protect his own dignity, and was demanding respect. He was saying, yes, it's true that I've come here, but I'm a worthy person and I've come here with skills. And the other party was basically saying, I don't care who you are. It doesn't matter what you think you can do. We just want you to, make, I don't know, $7.50 an hour. And so this was, I swear I saw sparks fly, even though there were no matches.
Yeah. Did that happen? Tell us a little, shed some light on how you came to the country.
Oh, I was a little girl when, in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution took place, and for several years, my parents and I just, stayed in Iran. I think it was, some people picked up and left very quickly in 1979 or a few months after, but and some people were even smarter, and they foresaw what was coming, and they left even before it came. But for my parents, it was a much harder decision to make for a variety of reasons. So we stayed for 5 years or so after the revolution had taken place, and there was a war between Iran and its neighbor to the south, which was Iraq. And it became clear after 5 years that nothing was going to improve. It didn't look like the war was going to end. My brothers, who were in America already from several years before, were not going to return. And therefore, it was time for us to leave. And so my mother and I came here to the United States as refugees in 1985.
And did your mother have to, go through some of what you talk about in your?
Yes, and I did too. It was, I was 19. I didn't speak English. And this refugee resettlement counselor talked to my mother and I. I think they sent her to some kind of a babysitting job at a small daycare in her neighborhood with very, very, very small babies and young toddlers. So language wasn't an issue. And then they sent said to me, well, you're very young and you'll pick up very quickly. So you go to work answering phone calls at this denture making office. And it was in New York City. And so they sent me to this denture making office in Manhattan. And, and I was supposed to answer phone calls. I was sort of the receptionist. And people would call and say, can I talk to Bob? And I would say, what? And they would say, well, it's Bob. And I would, can you say that again? And then, he would say Bob, and I would say, can you spell that? And, so I started I think on a Monday or a Tuesday, and by Friday I was fired. So it was just really too pathetic. I needed more language to have a job like that.
And is that when you went to college? Is that when you decided to enroll in college?
No, I thought I could do both, and eventually I did. I mean, I took a different job that required less language. I started working the night shift in a group, in a group home for disabled individuals, and so they were mostly asleep when I was there, and so I didn't need to talk. But no, I was working simultaneously. I was in college, and I had these night shifts also. So.
And you went to one of the CUNY schools?
I did. I went to Brooklyn College. So, a few years ago when Bernie Sanders kept, was in the news and was campaigning, and, every time he was asked what was the college he attended, and he said Brooklyn College, I felt like, yes, people other than me went there too. I had a great time. It was a wonderful experience for me.
Well, that's great. I just have to say that I'm a graduate of Queens College.
Oh, there you go. Yes. I took a summer course there. So,
and my parents, who were second generation immigrants, they had both gone to City College.
There you go. So, yeah. It was
time for us to go to college. There was no choice. Yeah. They said, "There you go."
Yes.
But yeah, I had a great education. The professors, it turned out, they got paid more at the CUNY schools. So we would get, really professors from all Ivy League schools that were teaching at Queens College, and they would commute from Manhattan and go to Queens. So anyway, great education. I
teach a writing course this semester at Yale, and a part of me still feels that I got a great education, even though I'm here now, and I see what these kids are getting. But my professors were amazing and truly invested in the kids. And in fact, I had a psychology professor who had followed the historic events in Iran until the year that I had arrived. So he had so much affection. He somehow knew, even though I hadn't told him, he somehow knew what I must be going through. So he was, he really took me under his wing. He made me his research assistant, and I didn't know how to research. It didn't matter, but I think he understood that I needed to have, some bond, someone to be around, and someone to ask questions from. It was really wonderful. I mean, the amount of care, attention, affection that I got in that system, the CUNY system, was incredible.
It's great to hear, really. Wanted to get to a topic that I love, which is poetry, and you talk about writing poetry in college. Can you talk to us a little about that, and maybe read from? I know your poems are in Farsi, But if you could maybe read one of your poetic passages from one of your books, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Actually, I started writing poetry when I was a teenager in Iran. It was a way to cope with all the tumult that was happening politically in the country, or at least it was for me. And so I just continued writing and writing and writing, and every time people saw it and gave me some encouragement, I felt uplifted, and especially if they themselves were literary grown-ups who seemed to know what they were talking about. So I just kept on writing. So there is a passage in the book that we've been talking about, A Beginner's Guide to America. And since you talked about, that the book actually has chapters where, chapter 1 kind of describes the immigrant's arrival and so on and so forth. This passage is from chapter 1, and the sort of the immigrant of the book, every immigrant in a way arrives, and she goes to sleep in her apartment, her new apartment in America. She wakes up the next day, there's a knock at the door, and a man shows up that she, after a couple of minutes, gathers must be the super of the apartment building. And the super introduces himself and tries to make conversation with this newly arrived immigrant. And at some point, he asks, "Where are you from?" So this passage is once the super has asked our immigrant, "Where are you from?" Her mind starts to run, and she starts to think how she should answer this question. So where are you from? And there, you have arrived at the most vexing 4 words of your early days in America. Your reaction to this will be, above all, one of alarm. Your immediate thought will be that your pleasant manner has failed. After all, he has found you out, knows you're not from here. You take it to mean that you do not belong, and if you have a particularly gloomy nature, you worry that you can never belong. Even after years of being here and trying to fit in, your accent or something else about you will always give you away, and the question, with a minor variation, can still haunt you. Where are you really from? When you're new, as you are on that first morning, anxiety explains all things before reason does. But in time, you will see that there are as many interpretations for those 4 words as there are words for snow for the Eskimo. Asking where you are from can often simply be a way of breaking the proverbial ice. You might say, "I'm from Thailand," to which the person asking the question could, in turn, excitedly say, "My housekeeper is Thai," or "I love drunken noodles." You might not be fond of your national cuisine, but no matter. "Where are you from?" is launched into the conversation only to further the introduction. Even the native-born ask each other the same question just to get acquainted. Sometimes it might lead to a wistful memory. "You're the spitting image of my cousin Maddie, may he rest in peace." Or, if the person asking is a single man or woman in pursuit of love, the following can ensue. "If everyone in your country looks like you, I know where I must go for my next vacation." So.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Do you find, do you always, I didn't get a chance to read your other books, but I think that you do always, there's a very poetic quality to your nonfiction.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's how I keep it fun for myself, because I feel like I need to introduce some of the old elements of what I'm used to into the new in order to feel like there's continuity between where I was or who I was and what I am now. So I do try to introduce, lyrical elements, or I shouldn't say I try, it's part of my
Yeah.
writing anyway. And I remember the first time I submitted my memoirs manuscript to my editor. She left a message later on my voicemail and said, "This is so beautiful. This is great, great, great." It was the first draft of my memoir. And then she said, "But I'm not sure I always know what it means." It was really, and I knew immediately that I had kind of gone over the top with the poetry, and I had become too vague, so I had to scale back. But yeah, I mean, I have to do it because I feel like this is who I am, and I need to kind of bring that heritage into this.
Okay. And one of the things you talk, I think today or just recently on Twitter, you posted that your late father, was a
Yeah,
poet.
yeah, he was. He was. My father was a principal of a school, and he was an educator for 4 decades almost. But his favorite hobby was to compose poetry, and I just loved watching him when I was small, because when he had some free time, he would find a little corner and he had a notebook, and he would sit all by himself in a corner. He would gaze out. You couldn't say or know exactly what he was looking at or where he was looking at, but he always looked like he was having a good time all by himself.
And did he read his poems to you?
Yeah, yeah, he did. I mean, there was no running away from him. I mean, he would write, and then his um, reward to himself, I think, was to read it aloud to everybody who was around. And this is so much more of a tradition within sort of the Iranian culture, that the way we play baseball, or is kind of part of the family life, right? Everybody has a bat and a mitt, and we go out and we play together and we throw the ball. Poetry reading was like that. It was sort of a pastime, and people, it was so widespread in all the families. And so my father would regularly recite his poetry aloud. And then when I was old enough, and when I was a teenager and I was writing, I would read mine in return. And because he was sort of a classical, more traditional writer, he always thought that I didn't know how to come up with rhymes, and I'd never learned what the proper poetry writing was like. So he would be critical of my um, form, and I was critical of his, old, outdated content. So we would go head to head, and it was fun. It was like two generations kind of
Yeah.
confronting each other about their sense of what was good art.
One of the things that struck me when you talked about your poem about the self in that the self, this searching for the self in America is so important. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think you wrote something about how this has allowed American poets to thrive, because there's so much they're not bound by as much tradition. Is that
Right, right. I mean, it's really interesting because, and you may have, you've looked at so much of my stuff, you may have seen these too. But I wrote in an essay once that I was so certain that whatever Americans had that was better than what we had, with which we came, at least we had the more ancient poetry, and so we were ahead where poetry was concerned. And it's really interesting because I realized after I read more that even though there is a much more ancient, um, you know, a greater volume, a greater tradition of poetry in Iran from hundreds of years ago till today, um, and even though English language poetry and American poetry is a much younger tradition, there is so much more variety to the English language poetry or American poetry in terms of themes than there is in Persian. And that's because, in part, we have placed in America such great emphasis on the self. We basically are all in the service of the self, and so the self has all sorts of ways of manifesting itself or kind of picking at itself to find new things to say, whereas in Persian, the self is far more subdued and is encouraged to try to take itself out and let other issues, other greater things shine, or the community, or the king, or whatever, but not the individual. And so that has kept Persian poetry from engaging in so many of the themes that we can find in American poetry. One of the specific ones that I wrote about once was, I think I read a poem called My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Rutke, and it was about child abuse. Obviously, it was a father who beat up his son, and it was the first time I was reading a poem on such a subject. You never have the Persian language just doesn't do that sort of thing. And I was stunned, and it was one of the most pleasant discoveries that I had made, in all the years that I'd come to America.
And what made you? I know that you said you studied with Allen Ginsberg at Brooklyn College.
Yes,
and
I did.
with his poetry, which is so the eye, the howl, and so around the eye, it's sort of the tradition of Whitman, and what did you? Why were you so eager to study with him?
I was just, well, I liked him so much, and he was such a warm and likable person anyway. But it was the first time I was daring to, after all the years that I had been in America, to think that I had learned enough English, or I felt at home enough in this country to do what I loved, which was to learn literature or to study literature. And so it was also sort of a statement on who I was in America and how settled, so to speak, I was. I thought, if I've stayed here long enough, and if I know what I'm doing, this is time. I deserve this. It was one of the most important experiences that helped me sort of cross from the permanent immigrant to cross the bridge to Americanness in some ways, because once he said you can come into my class, I felt like if Allen Ginsberg says I can be in his poetry class, that means I've learned enough English and I can pass. And so it was a very important moment for me, not just as a writer, but also it was a rite of passage into America in some ways.
And I think he let you in, even though the requirement was you had to have 30 English, poems written in English.
Yes, and I gave him my Persian language poetry and book, and he looked and he just said, "Groovy, you're in," and I said, "Great," and that's how I got in.
That's a great story. Beautiful story. Thank you. And what was it like, when you in the book that you wrote about in the memoir, you
Yeah,
call it, Journey from the Land of No.
right.
And would you say that was particularly that you felt that as a girl? Like, would your brothers have written their memoir and entitled it that way?
Probably not. Although I'm sure they would, if they heard me say that, they would think that I'm not sympathetic to their plight, that they didn't have it as easy as I think they did. But I think that what what made my experience vastly different than my brothers was that they left Iran prior to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and we stayed, for several years after. And I think that 1979 was just a very, very huge moment of rupture. And so I think, life kind of, uh, you know, uh, was divided, not, not by anything after that had happened, but by anything else, but that, pre-revolution and post-revolution. It was so important that we all would refer to our history as, uh, the my life prior to 1979 and then my life after 1979. It was sort of like, a moment of tragic genesis that divided time into two. So I think, the difference between my brothers and I, it was not so much a gender difference than it was sort of having lived through that experience.
Interesting. And initially, there was a hope that this would be a open society. This would open society from when the Shah was
I
in
mean,
control.
everybody always thinks that revolutions are going to go to a good place, and almost most of them never do. So this was
Mhm.
another.
And was it hard though for you as a minority, as a Jewish person? I mean, I know there are other minorities. You talk about that. What was that like, as a Jewish family, coming from a Jewish family?
It was those early years were difficult um, because they were just immediately after the Iranian Revolution. Iran was the regime was far more radical than it is today. It was a lot more ideological, a lot more ambitious than it is today, and I think therefore it repressed more. It repressed women more. It repressed uh, religious minorities more. So they were harder years, and I hear from members of the Iranian Jewish community that um, it's it's a ironically things have improved because it's a more mature regime, albeit still evil, but it's more mature, more secure in in its own position of power, and therefore less repressive in some ways, or at least with respect to the Jewish community. And so yeah, I mean those early years were difficult, and there were a lot of things, a lot of new rules and regulations that came into being that basically gave a lot of privileges to Shiite Muslims in Iran as opposed to religious minorities. So, anybody who wasn't a Shiite man in Iran um, became somewhat of a second class citizen thereafter.
And would you have had, would even a man have had the opportunity to go to college at when you
Yeah,
came to America? Or
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, but it was hard to get in those years because the there is this for sort of the best colleges in Iran. You at the time, the number of universities that were available were far more limited, and so there was this national exam, somewhat of a GRE process that you had to take, and but then the scores that you had to get in order to enter the university no longer had to do with your scholarly knowledge or your academic knowledge, but it also had to do with your religious knowledge. And therefore, if you were Jewish, you couldn't answer or perform well on the religious component, or offer recommendations from the local mosque, and that also gave the upper hand to people who would qualify for those
So
things.
it wasn't necessarily written, but
so it's interesting. It wasn't necessarily anti-Jewish measures, but it was just highly pro Shiite Muslim measures that were put in, and therefore you just lost in that competition to the person who had the upper hand.
And was that true for other minorities as well?
No, it wasn't. The Baha'i Iranians simply were considered heretics, and therefore they had a much harder time than Jews and Christians did, because Jews and Christians are considered people of the book, so they are legitimate, recognized religious minorities.
And how many, like when you were there, when you were when you left Iran, or in 1979, how big was the Jewish community? And
about 100,000. Yeah, it was about 100,000 then, but it's less than 10,000 now. So, there is a community left, but it's far smaller than it used to be.
And do you ever go? Have you ever gone back, or have any ties? No. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And do you, when you look at where we are now in America, as opposed to when you came here in the mid '80s, do you think that we have reason to be hopeful, despite what we see as a climate that is seems to be not more closed to immigrants?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. I think we've become a more tolerant society as a whole, but I think in some ways we have become more confused about immigration in general and immigrants, and we have kind of lost our way. And I see that both on the left and the right. I see that people on the left say certain things that are just untenable, like we should let them all in, or it's our fault that they're coming here. These
so
things
extreme kind of statements.
I mean, we can't let everybody in, simply because no matter how many we let in, there's just the problems that are driving people out of the countries where they're living are bottomless, and unless we address those problems, everybody from everywhere, because of environmental changes and just our planet being where it's heading, 1/3 of the world population is going to have to leave where they are, because they're going to run out of water, or they're going to have other disasters on their hands. So to say that we can house all of them in America is just simply silly. It's denying the seriousness of what's driving them out. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is that people on the right who say our country is full. Well, no, not really. You and I drive by places that could definitely use several thousand people to populate them, to bring them back from death, basically, certain communities. And, you know, no, they don't come here to rape and pillage and do things. And in fact, they do contribute in every way to our economy, to the health of our, you know, culture, you know, cuisine, music, all that. So I think we have just become somewhat confused as to, you know, how we should view this thing, because, you know, immigration, because, you know, both extremes have become even more extreme than they used to be. But I think in some ways, to kind of leave it on a positive note, I think in some ways we are a more tolerant society than we were when I first arrived,
And
more,
in what way do you say that?
well, we're more open to other cultures. We value the differences more. We're less gender unequal. We could still do better. We are, you know, more accepting of racial, ethnic, religious diversity, and all these things are great. And when they're great for the society in general, they're great for immigrants too, because, you know, immigrants come from different parts of the world, and they, you know, they're the people who introduce these, you know, points of variety into our culture.
And as a, you know, I think I saw an interview you did with Bill Crystal, and you said that as an Iranian coming to America, that in general the outcomes, and you know, that Iranians were able to you know, to achieve in America are greater than if you and your family had gone to Europe and stayed there.
That's true. You know, I mean, just statistically, Iranians are far more educated, far more affluent, far more at home in America than they are in other parts of the world. I mean, they're doing well in Europe too, but they're just doing that much better in America. And I attribute that in great part to the greater tolerance within the American society for, you know, for immigrants.
It's great. It's great to see. And I think maybe we don't see that, you know, because we're hearing so much about intolerance, and we don't, you know, if you compare it with where else.
Exactly. You know, we are far below, you know, paradise, but we are above the normal life and the earthly realities in other places. And, you know, unless you kind of pull back and look at the, you know, the big picture, the global picture, you won't see that we could always do better. But compared to what there is, we're doing pretty great.
Okay. Good to hear. Can you tell us, you know, one of the things I always do is ask my guests, there are 3 women to follow.
Yes. So I have to say, I'm very partial to one woman who is an Iranian feminist activist who's currently in prison, and her name is Yasaman Aryani. She isn't an anti veiling person. She isn't against the veil. She's against the laws that make the veil mandatory. So she has been trying to make the veil be a choice rather than a decision that, you know, the government makes for women to dress in a certain way. So she's advocating for you know, women to be allowed to have a choice of dress code. And so I sent you a video, and maybe you will provide the link to her video.
Okay.
She's walking, you know, she takes her headscarf off, and she walks in the rain with her hair exposed, and she starts singing, saying, you know, I'm singing in the rain, and, you know, it's beautiful to have rain fall on my hair, and it's a great feeling. And, you know, I don't know whether it was that day or another day, but just for doing that, She was arrested and she has been in prison for a few years, and she's only in her 20s, but she's a great spirit, and I want everybody to
خیلی
kind
همه دخترها پیشنهاد میکنم که حجابتون رو بردارین و از این بارون بهاری لذت ببرین. روز جهانی زن هستش. که یه روزی ما زنان چه با حجاب چه بی حجاب با هر مذهبی کنار همدیگه قرار بگیریم.
Yeah. So I don't know. I just think it's lovely. And the other person is, one of my own great influences, Forough Farrokhzad. She's a great female poet of the last century. She only lived until she was 33, 34 and had a car crash and died, but left a really beautiful literary legacy behind. And many of her poetry has been translated and is available, I think, online. And the third one I came across when I was sort of looking at stories of immigrant communities in America, and I was learning about, the trials of Chinese immigrants in America. And I came across the story of Anna May Wong, who was a great actress, but she was typecast into these evil, Chinese roles, and she could never be given serious roles in Hollywood until, she basically moved out of America for a while, and people started to reevaluate and think about her differently. And then she returned, and I just thought her resilience and just story of Chinese Americans in America really a story of both great tragedy, but also at the end a great triumph.
Thank you. Exciting. I will look at these women and I'll put them out. And looking ahead, can you talk about if you're working on another book or a new initiative or more human rights work?
I'm going to be writing a couple of commissioned, hopefully longer pieces. I realize that I've done a lot of stuff, but they most of them have been in short essay forms, and it's time to break into a different format. So I plan on doing a couple of long investigative pieces in the next year or so, and I'm also trying to think up what my next book is going to be. I'm not sure I know yet, but hopefully soon, because I get very antsy when I don't have one I'm working on.
And are there any, parting words you'd like to tell our viewers?
Only that, we are really all in this together, no matter what our diversities of opinions may be or disagreements may be. There are much greater evils in the world that endanger and threaten our basic freedoms and rights, that in order to deal with them and fight with them, we need to understand that the things that makes us, gives us disagreements or seem to be driving us apart are minor compared to those bigger battles that we all must fight, which, in part, Ukrainians are fighting on behalf of all of us at the moment. So,
and how do you, do you see their, are you just the horror? There's horror, but are you in any way encouraged by what we're seeing and how the world is trying? Many countries in the world are responding.
Yeah, well, everybody can do more, because I do think that there is one major difference between this war and and other wars of this century, and the difference between this war and all those wars of this century is that this one is about everybody. It's not just some tribal war between two factions of a society in some godforsaken place. It's not some kind of a religious strife between two sects. It's really about the essence of democracy and the freedoms that we have gained as a world community in the 20th century, as opposed to its opposite, which is authoritarianism. So I think this is a war that is about all of us, and we need to understand that the differences that we think at the moment.
Just froze for a second. Let's see. Okay, I think you're good. Let's see. Roya? Okay. Roya, thank you so much for joining me. It was such an honor and such a pleasure to meet you. Your books are your anecdotes and are just charming and very incisive. And I can't wait to read your other books, and I look forward to what you write next. So
Thank you
so much for joining me.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Roya.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. She gone?